Welcome to the Young Turks. Anna Kasparian and John Iadarola with you. What's up, John?
It's going.
It's going. I guess that's better than not going.
It's a news day.
It's a news day, yes.
Yes.
All right, well, we have a lot of news to get to. We're gonna start off with some election coverage. There's a lot going on with the Democratic primary, including some excellent reporting by Sean King, which we will detail for you. Later in the show, we'll also give you updates on the Senate impeachment trial, including what Chuck Schumer is pretending like he's gonna do in order to force the Senate to call witnesses in the trial. But if you were to ask me for my prediction, this whole thing is likely to be over by tomorrow because Republicans always get what they want because they know how to fight for what they want. Anyway, so without further ado, why don't we get to the rundown? You ready? All right. Joe Biden has made all sorts of statements about his activism in the civil rights movement. Now, in the beginning of his career, he made similar statements that he's making today on the campaign trail, and then he got caught lying. And for a huge chunk of his political career, he stopped telling those lies. However, Sean King, who is a wonderful journalist and activist, has done an extensive piece that looks into what he lied about before and what he's currently lying about, and he provided specific examples in the form of video evidence. And I think it's important to point these things out because if someone hasn't actually been active or a huge part of the civil rights movement and uses it for their own political gain while campaigning, that's a huge problem. And it does pose a giant weakness should Biden make it to the general election. So let's start off with what Sean King finds. First, he kind of summarizes his findings through his investigative reporting. He says, I've counted at least 31 different lies Biden has told about being an activist, organizer, sit-in demonstrator, boycott leader, voter registration volunteer, black church trainee, and more in the civil rights movement. But every single time I dig, I actually find more interviews, more lies, more fabrications, and more tales he told to voters, reporters, historians, and more. Let's stop for a minute. I have no doubt that in simply covering this story, which I think is an important story to cover, we'll get backlash from Democrats who believe that the most important thing to do is to beat Donald Trump. And so you're not allowed to do any critique or any criticism of any of the candidates. If you're interested in a show that's gonna lie to viewers about the reality of these candidates, then you shouldn't watch this show. We need to be honest and we need to point to the weaknesses of these candidates to ensure that we elect the right person in this primary to go head to head against Donald Trump. So if you genuinely care about beating Donald Trump, you would look at these weaknesses and understand that Biden ain't it. Okay, he's not the one who's gonna beat him. Let me give you more details. In repeated interviews, campaign events, and national keynote speeches at the Democratic conventions of both Maine and California, Biden told wild tales of how he marched, sat in, and boycotted during the civil rights movement, and even went so far as to suggest that he had traveled to Selma and Birmingham with such actions. But with his campaign in tatters, he finally said they were lies, they were all lies in September of 1987. So in 1987, he gets caught. He's telling all these lies about his activism. He gets caught and he finally admits that he actually wasn't that active. So on two very important occasions, Sean King writes, Joe Biden actually told the entire truth about his involvement in the civil rights movement. Nearly everything else has been a lie. So what was his first truth? This is a direct quote from Joe Biden from September of 1987. Here's what he said. During the 1960s, I was in fact very concerned about the civil rights movement. I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling, but I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to black Americans. Now, the second truth we learned about Joe Biden goes as follows. This is another statement from Joe Biden. I worked there, a swimming pool, back in the early 60s when Freedom Ride sit-ins and Bull Connor's dogs and fire horses were starting to get people's attention. Like everybody in America in those years, I was getting dramatic lessons about segregation and civil rights from newspapers and television. So this shows that Joe Biden was like most other white Americans at the time. He was learning about the civil rights movement through media coverage, but he wasn't actually involved in the activism. Now, unfortunately, he has decided to revive these lies for his 2020 campaign. And so we're gonna talk about that in just a minute. But John, I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in.
Yeah, those two portrayals, especially if at the time he's not super young, but he's not an older guy. Okay, like yeah, it would have been better if you got involved. Some people did, including some candidates, but it's totally fine to learn about these things. You were insulated from the realities of the world. That was what many of these communities were designed to do. And then you suddenly start to realize what's actually going on. That would be perfectly fine. You would expect better positions in that time later on as he ages on things like busing and stuff like that. If he really was learning about all of this at the time, the lessons didn't seem to kick in for quite a while, but that would be one thing. It's then to say, well, that's not exciting enough, that's not interesting enough. I need to win a particular election, and that history just doesn't do anything for me. So I'm gonna craft one. And the thing that surprises me was that it was discovered to be lies at all. Because we're talking like the very beginning of the internet. It's much more difficult to track down information in this way, but thankfully at that time they did.
Exactly. So let's talk about what's happening today, because I think that's where you find the weaknesses in Joe Biden as a candidate and what Trump is gonna use against him if he goes head to head with Biden. So according to what Sean King wrote, from 1987 until 2014, Joe Biden appeared to refrain from telling any lies about his role in the civil rights movement. But suddenly, while giving a speech at a King Day breakfast in January of 2014 for the National Action Network, he resorted back to the same old debunked lies and also added one brand new one that had never been told in his entire life, saying he was regularly trained for the civil rights movement in 1960 on Sunday mornings in black churches. Here's that video, take a look, A2.
I got involved in desegregated movie theaters and helping, you may remember Reverend Moyer in Delaware and Herman Holloway organized voter registration drives, coming out of black churches on Sundays, figuring how we were gonna move.
So he just decided to flat out lie. I mean, by his own admission in 1987, he didn't get involved in any of that activism. But in 2014, while giving that speech, he talks about how he was active in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I don't want to go crazy with speculation, I guess, but I almost wonder if at one point decades ago, he crafted all these lies and then eventually was forced to own up to the fact that it wasn't true. And we understand what his actual situation back then actually was. As he gets older, I wonder to what extent like the lies that he used to told start to be a reality in his mind. Not to say that he's not lying, clearly he is, but I'm saying like if he's been telling these lies, whether publicly or privately for literally decades, at some point do you start to believe some of what you've been saying? Every time you exaggerate a little bit more, you add new details, all of that, we see it with Trump all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we do know that people, like oftentimes when they want to justify something to themselves, they'll tell themselves something until they actually believe it, right? And so that is something that does happen to people. But what I do find interesting is that for a giant chunk of his political career, from 1987 to 2014, he completely stopped in telling these civil rights movement lies.
At least in public.
At least in public, and any type of fact-checked material, including his personal autobiography, right? It's fact-checked, meaning that you can't just lie about what you've been involved in those types of mediums, whether it's books or fact-checked articles, those types of things. And so nothing about his so-called civil rights activism is included in his autobiography. So look, I don't know. I mean, the point that you're making is interesting because he does seem to have like these weird moments where I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know if this is like something having to do with his age. I don't know, and I don't want to speculate. What I do know is here's the evidence, here's what the record says, and here's what Joe Biden is currently campaigning on. And when he's up against Donald Trump is gonna be like, well, you know, I was thinking about attacking Joe Biden on the campaign trail, but I decided not to because who knows, maybe he told himself these lies for so long that he's actually begun to believe them. No, and by the way, that's a weak defense anyway.
I don't think it's a defense at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, based on like what I have read about the brain and memory and how it works, things like when you tell a story, it is to some extent dangerous in terms of your memory, because the thing, like if a thing happens and I recount it to someone, I'm not going to talk about all of the details of what happened. I'm going to talk about some of the details. The next time I recount that story, you're not going back to the original source memory fresh. You're going back to the memory also of you telling the story,
right.
Which means some things start to get reinforced in your mind. And some things, if they're exaggerated when you tell later on, and this is actually possibly true of Elizabeth Warren when she was recounting conversations with Bernie Sanders. If you exaggerate a bit when you describe something, and then you describe it again in that way, and then again, you start to believe the exaggerated version. Now, apparently there was actually nothing to what Biden's actually saying, but the biggest issue isn't just that he is trying to make his past more impressive. Politicians do that literally all the time. But think about what it represents in this primary, that specifically as he enters into the first 4 states where it doesn't look like he's gonna do very well, and his whole strategy is hold the line until Super Tuesday when southern states can give me back the delegates I'm not getting elsewhere. Well, then demographically, to tell a lie that crafts this sort of identity as being a civil rights activist is really, I mean, that's disgusting. If your strategy is to stimulate black votes for yourself in the South, then that really deserves the fact checking that Sean King is providing there.
Well, there's more. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And to be quite honest with you guys, we don't have enough time on the show to focus solely on everything that was unearthed by Sean King, which is why you should read his full piece. We'll include a link in the description box below. But with that said, let's go to more of what he found. These are the highlights of what came across in my reading of Sean King's work. In Waterloo, Iowa, on this past December 5th, 2019, Biden began telling falsehoods again about being an activist and organizer, and then added new color to the lie from 2014 that he was being trained as an activist in black churches on Sunday mornings. Here's that video.
Because when I was about the age of the guy standing over there, I got involved in the civil rights movement. My state is a state that was segregated by law. And we have the 8th largest black population in the United States of America as a percent of population. And my passion was ignited when I saw what was happening. When we moved down from a place called Scranton, Pennsylvania, we had very few minorities in that city. But I moved down to Delaware when I was in 3rd grade, a little town called Claymont. And what I found out was that there was a significant African-American population. But guess what? They weren't able to go to school, the places that we went to school. And I remember asking my mom, what was that all about? And she explained to me, I thought, how can that be? And so I got engaged. I never planned on running for public office. I love reading biographies of me now about how I knew I was going to run for the United States Senate. I knew I was going to run for president. Didn't know that at all. But I got my education, Reverend Doc, in the black church. Not a joke. Because when we used to get organized on Sundays to go out and desegregate movie theaters and things like that, we do it through the black church.
So Sean King shed some light in explaining why that particular claim is ridiculous and easy to spot as a lie. So he writes, in 1960, during the civil rights movement, even in the Deep South, even in churches pastored by Dr. King himself, Sunday morning was not at all like a Monday night planning meeting or strategy session. Sunday mornings were sacred religious moments of prayer, song, praise, offering, sermon, and invitation. Even during the Montgomery bus boycott, Sunday morning services were almost exclusively religious in nature.
Yeah.
And so for anyone who knows that history, you can spot that lie from a mile away. And I do want to offer one other specific example of Biden campaigning on his civil rights activism that didn't actually happen. So on January 20th, so this is very recent, this year, Biden repeated his lies again at a special service at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Columbia, South Carolina. Take a look.
You know, when I was a teenager in Delaware, for real, I got involved in the civil rights movement. We have the 8th largest black population in America. Most people don't know that. And I'd go to 8 o'clock mass, then I'd go to Reverend Herring's church where we'd meet in order to organize and figure where we were going to go whether we're going to desegregate the Rialto movie theater or what we were going to do.
And just to give you more detail and information into the context and the reality, Sean King writes, the Reverend Herring he speaks of is the late legendary Reverend Otis Herring of Union Baptist Church in Wilmington. Other times this year, when Biden tells this story, he says he'd leave Mass and go to the late Reverend Maurice Moyer's church. I spoke to former members of their churches, as well as people close to both families. Neither stories are true. Joe Biden met both of these men much later in life and only learned about their great work in retrospect. Look, politics aside, the campaign aside, you're right. I mean, to brag about yourself and lie about what you've done when it comes to something as serious as the civil rights movement is just gross. Even if he weren't a politician, let's say he's a professor and he used that to his advantage to get his tenured position at some university. It's gross. It's gross because there are people who lost their lives. They put their lives on the line for that movement. And many of those people have been forgotten. Many of those people were never got the opportunity to see the outcome of that movement. And here's Joe Biden, he brags about how much support he has from the African American community. I honestly get super uncomfortable with the way the horse race is talked about and how demographics are talked about, because it feels like everyone is it's just an object, right? Each group is an object, and like, what am I gonna do to win that object? And it's just, I don't think it's the right way to talk about politics, but it happens all the time. I don't know, this is, I think, a giant weakness, but more importantly, I think this is very revealing about Biden's character, and it really bothers me.
Yeah, and to go back to what you said at the very beginning about like, oh, how could you talk about this? It's gonna hurt him, and that could eventually, he could be the nominee. Well, like, wouldn't you prefer it comes out now rather than Trump? Because I got news for you. Trump is he'll use everything that's possible, make up a bunch of other stuff, but he'll also use everything that's possible. Maybe we should find out about it now during a primary election where you're totally allowed to differentiate between the different candidates through their positions, their statements, but also their histories, both real and imagined. And with Biden, the thing that bothered me the most is we can like take all of what we're learning now, the stories he's telling and the reality, the stories he told back then, but we can also put it in context of what we know about the things he was saying along the way. He told a story like 3 videos ago about having a conversation with his mother where he came to understand that African American kids couldn't go to school in certain areas, and that was a big learning moment for him. But then like 15 years later, when he's giving speeches about busing and he wants to show himself to be like the right sort of white politician, he demonizes busing programs. Right. So which is it? Is it just a total lie, which apparently it was, that you had that conversation with your mom? Or did you actually have that revelation, but when it was convenient for you, you really wanted to appeal to racist white people, so you talked about busing as this societal evil that needed to be stopped or at least slowed down? So there was a lot of outrage over Joe Rogan's quasi endorsement of Bernie Sanders. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because people, I think rightfully so, have been uncomfortable with things that Joe Rogan has said in the past, right? And they have taken Joe Rogan's statements and used it to attack Bernie Sanders. That was a huge story. It dominated news feeds for an entire day and a little bit over the weekend as well. This story, I'm not seeing a lot of backlash about this. And that's what's amazing to me, because here you have the candidate himself lying about his own record and his own involvement in the civil rights movement for political gain. And that is far more offensive than Bernie Sanders getting endorsed by someone you don't like. Yeah, anyway. And in particular, like any candidate who's being shown to be persistently lying for decades, literally, that should be an issue. But if the identity that you've set yourself up as, like the person you are is the no malarkey guy, it's literally like the sign no malarkey tour was in some of those videos where he's lying. I know. Well, then that should be even a bigger issue. Like you're saying the advantage you have is straight talk and honesty, when you have a multi-decade long history of lying about this particular area. And look, we got a debate coming up next week. There's time for those moderators to look into this and to ask some tough questions. I'm sure they'll ask. Yeah, I kind of doubt it. Yeah, same.
We got to take a break. We'll be right back with more news, including some accusations about Pete Buttigieg's campaign coming from his own staff members. We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying this free clip from the Young Turks. If you want to get the whole show and more exclusive content while supporting independent media, become a member at tyt.com/join today. In the meantime, enjoy this free segment.
Welcome back to TYT, Anna and John with you. I was just saying during the break, like, what if this story that we just covered about Biden lying about his activism in the civil rights movement were a story about Bernie instead? And believe you me, I would be super apologetic about supporting him. And I would tell the truth about what he's done. Like, this isn't a joke, right? Like, so if you're serious about beating Trump, this is not a joke. By the way, forget Trump for a second. If you're serious about electing the right person to represent you, to represent this country, this is a story you should care about. The record is something that you should look into. It's not about like, oh, this person's likable. The number one thing that people cite in their support for Biden is that they have been convinced that he is the best candidate to beat Donald Trump. And that is just not the case. There's no evidence to that point, none. It blows my mind. Anyway, quick note before we go to member comments. Iowa caucus, that's happening next week. Everything's happening next week.
Literally everything.
Next week is
the 2024 election is happening next week.
Not literally everything, but a lot. So we have the Iowa caucuses happening, and we have exciting special programming lined up for you. So we're going to cover the Iowa caucuses starting at 9 p.m. Eastern time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Ben Mankiewicz, Emma Vigeland, John Iadarola, Cenk Uygur, and myself will be part of the coverage. It's gonna be great.
It's gonna be so exciting.
It's gonna be great. Emma's not gonna be in studio, but she's gonna be covering the caucuses on the ground. So she's gonna be reporting in, it's gonna be awesome. So make sure you check it out. And if you can see on this graphic, and if you're listening to podcasts and you can't see the graphic, you can catch the coverage on a number of different platforms, including Roku, Zumo, YouTube TV, Pluto TV, Xfinity, X1, Xfinity Flex. Okay, so there's a lot of Xfinity going on. So,
there's a lot,
so make sure you check that out. All right, and then just a few comments before we move on. Meg says, Joe Biden was very concerned about the civil rights movement, like concerned it would be successful. Yeah, that statement was weird. I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was concerned about what was happening to the African-American community.
Yeah, he's said and done enough things for us to criticize him on that we don't have to assert motivations that we don't have strong evidence
for. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Also, Terry Teeter, a teeter-totter German teacher, writes in from our member section. If the main thing is beating Trump, we need to vet out candidates. I totally agree. Trump will point to these stories in the general election. And then Nick, look, you're, in my opinion, the winner with this comment because it's so good. If you're interested in someone who won't lie to you to pacify the misdeeds of their administration, you should vote for someone else. Which is something that Biden says to anyone who challenges him even a little bit. So, all right, well, let's move on to other candidates in the Democratic primary. Some of Pete Buttigieg's staffers are concerned with the way people of color are being treated within his campaign. In fact, in interviews with half a dozen current and former members of his campaign, the New York Times has released some details of what these concerns are. Now, some of them, I think we should have a discussion about whether they're really as bad as the New York Times is making it out to be. But I do think that there are some valid concerns here that should be brought to the public's attention, especially when you consider Pete Buttigieg's record in South Bend, Indiana as the mayor. We've done extensive reporting here at TYT on that. The police department had considerable racial tensions, and Buttigieg was very much ready and willing to fire the town's first African-American police chief, Daryl Boykins. But what are the new accusations coming from members of his campaign? Well, according to the Times, current and former staff members of color say they believed that Senator Buttigieg officials didn't listen to their concerns and ideas about the campaign. One said there was a daily emotional weight on people of color who felt they were employed in order to help the campaign meet its ambitious diversity targets. Now, the people working on his campaign, or the campaign itself, is actually very diverse. But what they're arguing is, in an effort to make it diverse, they didn't really care too much about the thoughts or the vision of these individuals. They just cared about meeting a certain quota. Also, some Hispanic employees said managers asked them to translate text even if they didn't speak Spanish, making them feel disrespected. So there's more, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts before we move on to the rest of it.
Yeah, so later on, you've got a couple of references that I think are probably definitely specific to the Buttigieg campaign. Overall, though, I would say, I mean, if you talk to the staff of any candidate, I bet there's a lot of these same sorts of concerns. I mean, some candidacies are probably better than others, but I mean, like most of the candidates are white. Most of the people that historically they choose as leadership in their campaigns are white. They're going to treat like that sort of discrimination is, I would imagine, not unique to Buttigieg's campaign.
Yeah, look, there have been issues with many campaigns on racial tension, lack of representation. Buttigieg has actually chosen people of color in high level positions within the campaign, so I do give him credit for that. But if there are lower level staffers who aren't feeling like they're respected or being heard, that should be considered. And to Buttigieg's credit,
definitely. I just wonder to what extent it actually has much to do specifically with Buttigieg's campaign and not just the sort of inherent racist nature of America.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let me give you some of the specific accusations from the piece and then we can discuss. So some employees of color spoke about feeling disrespected by white colleagues. Others said they felt stressed from having to answer questions from friends and family members about working for a candidate struggling with minority voters. So look, I get that. I certainly understand what it feels like to have to answer to members of your community for working for a company or for a person that they don't particularly like or find problematic. But so far, there isn't anything specific, too specific, so let's give you more.
Well, I think that's a little bit specific in that like people are throwing around polls where among African American voters he's at 0% or 1% or 2% or whatever. I imagine that's probably, first of all, it means that you're probably getting asked the question a lot just because it's one of the narratives about his campaign and that probably wears on you. But then also the sort of the implication is, wait, if you're a person of color, why are you working for someone who clearly has problems with this community? Like, if they just genuinely support him, that's gotta suck too, to have like your own identity used against you when you're just pursuing a political, like, a thing that you support.
Yeah, but my point is, this isn't something that Buttigieg did to the staffers. This is something that the staffers unfortunately have to deal with from, people outside the campaign who are concerned about his record. Now, his record is something that I think is fair game, but to say that his campaign is like actively doing something that's making them, it's not like his campaign's like reaching out to people in various communities and telling them like, hey, harass my staffers who, that's not what's happening.
Probably not.
No, that's not what's happening. But there are other things. So a second meeting, they've been having meetings about, how to make people feel listened to, appreciated. And so a second meeting on January 2nd featured lengthy discussions of the importance of diversity in hiring and sometimes tearful descriptions of the difficulty of recruiting people of color to the staff. One employee also recalled a troubling incident for staff members of color. The campaign had planned a fundraiser with a donor who had helped try to suppress the release of video showing the police shooting of a Black Chicago teenager. Okay, so that was the Laquan McDonald case. Yeah. So let me give you the details on that, because that is the part that I find like the worst aspect of this story, because it is very specific. And based on what the staffers are telling the New York Times, they raised their concerns and they were ignored. So in October, the campaign was rocked by revelations that among the hosts of a scheduled Chicago fundraiser was Steve Patton, a lawyer who had tried to block the release of footage of the 2014 police shooting of Black teenager Laquan McDonald. After Black leaders, including Jesse Jackson, objected, the campaign distanced themselves from Patton. So it wasn't until there was like public outcry that Buttigieg's campaign was like, all right, maybe we shouldn't work with this guy. Maybe this is a bad idea. Yeah. But if the whole point of hiring people of color into your staff is to listen to them. It's not just to like show the world, like, look how diverse my staff is. It's to get their perspectives.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if you're having meetings where it's like, man, like, we acknowledge we need to have a more diverse staff, but like nobody wants to work for us. Maybe like diversifying your staff isn't the only issue. Maybe there are bigger issues about who you are and what you're projecting out there about your priorities and your past and your refusal to answer questions about it. Like maybe you could solve both of those problems by making substantive changes in these areas.
The way that it comes off is, all right, I want to be like every other politician where I look polished and the aesthetics are there, right? Not aesthetics meaning how Pete Buttigieg looks, but more importantly, the aesthetics of his campaign, right? Look how diverse it is, but it's a very shallow attempt to address very real problems with his record. And it's also a shallow attempt at including voices that need to be listened to when it comes to important issues and proposals that are being put out by his campaign. So it doesn't matter if you have a diverse staff if you're not interested in listening to what concerns them and what their perspectives are. Now, Buttigieg responded to the New York Times with this statement. We're proud of the staffers who stood up and made their voices heard to help our campaign improve and be more inclusive. We realize that we can always do better, and these honest discussions are how we make progress, and we will continue to provide our staff the safe space to have them. And look, to his credit, they did have the meeting. This is before the New York Times article came out, so it's not like he was doing it for PR. They did have that internal meeting to hear people out because there was growing concern within the campaign about how people were feeling ignored and disenfranchised.
Yeah, look, I don't know if he just doesn't really care to change. And by change, I mean your platform, like not just like opting people into endorsing you in emails and things like that. That weird story we talked about a few weeks ago. His refusal to be honest about what happened while he was mayor. He like refused to answer questions about it like at all. He's not cooperating with investigations, those sorts of things. I mean, journalistic, not legal investigations. Or if he's just decided, you know what? I've got the advantages I've got. There are some, I'm just gonna ride this thing out. And you know what, if people don't wanna support me, I guess I'm just gonna double down in Iowa and New Hampshire and hope that momentum develops. Like there seems to be a sort of, like maybe internally there's some effort, but substantively about his campaign, there's a great deal of apathy.
Right.
And I think that is not just a thing that will hurt him in the primaries. That is definitely a thing that would hurt him in the general election if he were the candidate. Because you are taking for granted groups that you cannot take for granted.
100%. And I do want to read one quick comment from one of our members. Tommy Too Strong wants to respond to how you've handled this story and others. John is the most equitable person in the media. Stay reasonable, my friend.
I don't know exactly what you mean, but thank you.
No, you don't jump to conclusions, and I think that's important. So
I try.
Especially with stories like this, because we know from personal experience that there's all sorts of scoops that members of the media get, and it's coming from people with nefarious intentions and agendas. And so it is important to take these stories and take them seriously, because if people are feeling excluded and ignored in the campaign, that is a problem. But also understand that sources like the New York Times don't have a good track record when it comes to covering some candidates. All right, so if you want to be a member, you can become one by going to tyt.com/join. Thank you to Tommy for that comment. All right, let's move on to other news. Oftentimes, when it comes to support from the African American community for the Democratic Party, Republicans like Donald Trump would argue that Democrats just pay them off. They just go into these communities, give them money, or do so in the form of welfare programs, and that's the reason why Black voters will usually overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates. First of all, let's just acknowledge how insanely insulting that is to the Black community. But more importantly, let's also acknowledge that it's a classic case of projection, because Trump allies have been going into predominantly African American communities and they've been giving them money, literally. And they've been doing so in ways that could be deemed illegal, but it doesn't matter because it's Donald Trump. So illegal campaign issues apparently can't touch him.
It's in pursuit of re-election, which is in the public interest, obviously, as we found out.
We'll get to that story later today, but let's give you the details of this story reported in Politico. The first giveaway took place last month in Cleveland, where recipients whose winning tickets were drawn from a bin landed cash gifts in increments of several $100s stuffed into envelopes. A second giveaway scheduled for this month in Virginia has been postponed, and more are said to be in the works. So they're literally going into these towns and they're doing these raffles. These Trump allies are holding these raffles. And the organization doing this is listed as a nonprofit that's giving out money as charity because you can't buy people's votes. That's against the law. But this is not a charitable organization. They're listed as one, but their activity does not fall under the category of charitable, right?
Yeah, so I don't know. I sort of feel weird about this. Obviously, it's condescending and underhanded, and it shows what these people think about these communities, that they can try to buy them off. But like, they can't literally buy the votes. Anyone there can take the envelope of money and be like, thank you, and then vote for whoever they want. And they did get the money.
No,
so
John, this is illegal. It's illegal.
Well,
what they're doing is
yes. No, but clarify the illegality. That's what I want to know.
Oh, you want to know the okay?
I do. Yeah.
First of all,
I'm open-minded.
If you are a charitable organization, you can hold an event on like political issues, but you are not allowed because you have tax exempt status, right? You cannot endorse a specific person.
Yes.
They are endorsing a specific person. Secondly, in order to qualify as a charitable organization, the money that you're giving out needs to be proven to be given to a person who is in charitable need. And that is not what's happening here. Let me give you the details.
Okay, no, you go. What?
Because we hold, like, for some reason, like, here's the law, right? This is where you need to be to break the law. But with Trump, it's like he's here, but I don't know, is he breaking the law? Yeah, this is law breaking. That's what's happening right now. Let me give you the details.
First of all, he is allowed to break the law. Let's just agree there.
Yeah,
okay?
He's breaking the law
totally
every
allowed.
day, all day.
Yes.
He's violating our Constitution. I mean, but it doesn't matter, and that's the thing that blows my mind. I mean, there have already been illegal campaign contributions in regard to the 2016 campaign in the form of hush money payments to adult actresses. Doesn't matter, doesn't matter. Let's move on.
That was one of the
freebies. By the way, my frustration is more toward the Democrats who chose not to pursue that. Let me move on.
Yeah, Nancy Pelosi, top of the list on that.
Can't stand it. The cash giveaways are organized under the auspices of an outside charity, the Urban Revitalization Coalition, permitting donors to remain anonymous and make tax-deductible contributions. So the people donating to Trump's campaign under this charitable foundation then get to turn around and deduct what they gave in their taxes.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Let me give you more. Charities are required to spend their money on charitable and educational activities. It's not immediately clear to me how simply giving money away to people at an event is a charitable act. Video of the giveaway posted to Facebook by the Cleveland Plain Dealer shows Lanier, he's one of the co-founders of this so-called organization, announcing one recipient, Teresita Jones Thomas, then declaring, "She don't need the money, she don't need the money." A LinkedIn profile for Jones Thomas describes her as a senior director of accounting for a real estate management firm. Her son, Warriors forward Omari Spellman, is set to make close to $2 million this season.
Oh, he's doing well.
So is that enough evidence for you?
Yeah, well, but I think you're responding to things you might think that I'm thinking rather than things I'm actually thinking.
Tell me.
So first of all, I guess just philosophically, in terms of what should qualify as charity, look, that seems less charitable than other uses of your money.
That is not charitable, John.
Hold on, just let me lay out my case before you attack me.
Okay.
I'm feeling very attacked right now. If you were to go into a community of people actually in need and just give them money, how would that not be charitable?
But that's not what's happening. And also,
if
you're doing so while endorsing a specific candidate, which is what's happening here.
That's the biggest issue, yes.
That's the biggest issue.
Yes.
There's two issues. I think they're both big issues. Number one, a charitable organization is not supposed to endorse. They're not supposed to use their charity as a political arm for a candidate, and that's what they're doing.
They get tax exempt status specifically because they do not do that.
Exactly.
Or in theory, they don't do that.
We're telling you this story because I think it's outrageous. Nothing's gonna happen about it, so I'm just getting outraged for no reason. Because Trump is above the law. The goons that support him and do these disgusting things are above the law, and that's the country we live in, right? There is a two-tier justice system. If anyone else did this, they'd be in prison, or they would have to pay a giant fine for using this tax-exempt status in order to push for a political candidate. But with Trump, doesn't matter.
No, but see, and it actually goes even farther because if the IRS was to investigate them and find them, Fox News would lose it. They're coming after conservative organizations. That's what they would say.
One more graphic for you. The group's Christmas extravaganza event in Cleveland last month featured a $25,000 giveaway and an appearance by Jaron Smith, a deputy assistant to the president. At the event, which also featured an appearance by television personality Geraldo Rivera, co-founder Karim Lanier compared the investigative scrutiny faced by Trump to the plight of wrongfully incarcerated black men. He also defended Trump's record on race. So this is the kind of propaganda that they're spreading. But let's just hold on. Just forget about the criminality of what they're doing for a second and just focus on the argument that was made there. They're comparing the weak investigations into Trump's criminal behavior in the White House to what black men have had to face in this country when it comes to our justice system. That is so incredibly gross.
Yeah, a little bit inaccurate too, because generally those black men can't go into their courtroom and be like, I've decided no witnesses, no evidence. I'd prefer if you didn't do that. Yeah, it's a slightly different situation. Also not new though, this is the latest instance of it, but how many times did they call the impeachment inquiry or the Mueller report a high-tech lynching? They kept saying that over and over again, effectively making the same comparison.
So, that's the story. I'm gonna take a break and take a deep breath, and we will be right back.